Hello and welcome to Global LPG Conversations, Argus's podcast where we go through the latest developments in LPG markets and prices. My name is David Alton. I'm VP for LPG at Argus Media. Today I'm joined by Valdemar Jaszczyk, Deputy Editor in our London office. Hello, Valdemar.
Hi, David.
How are you today?
Yeah, all good. A bit chilly with the winter, but otherwise can't complain.
Chilly, that's also something that LPG distributors don't complain about as well. Very much a key topic at this time of year. We are going to talk a little bit about this kind of thing today because we're going to cover the Eastern European market in particular. Valdemar's been really looking at the situation in Poland and neighboring countries since the ban on Russian LPG imports into the EU was implemented on the 20th of December. And kind of a view on what we've seen in the run up to that ban, just to recap, and then also afterwards and what the impact has been. So, Valdemar, let's just start with the general context there. So what's, in terms of the impact of the end of Russian LPG imports, really, where does that hit hardest?
For some background, the embargo was going to hit mainly Central Eastern European countries, in particular Poland. The country historically, the country relied on imports of Russian LPG by rail to fuel its almost 2 million tons per year autogas market, the biggest one in the EU. The domestic output from the country's refineries only meets about 1/5 of the demand. So this was not a surprise. We've discussed it at our many times over that the embargo was in the air since 2022, and when it was announced last December 2023, importers were granted a 1-year transitional period to enable them to find alternative supplies. And the industry began to move away from its dependency on Eastern product over the last few years. Russia's share of Polish LPG imports dropped to less than half in 2023 versus 58% 2021 and as high as over 70% pre-pandemic. The country's 3 Baltic Sea terminals have been responsible for the bulk of this diversification drive, with seaborne LPG imports into Poland increasing by over half in 2023 versus 2021 to a record high of over 1 million tons.
Okay, so so you give me the impression here, and maybe it's just an initial impression that this was kind of a very smooth process, but when there's some snags along the way here?
Well, yes. Despite this effort, the Polish market could not quite wean itself off Russian imports due to 2 pretty fundamental factors. One was inadequate infrastructure for imports. Another, the price difference between the Russian product and alternatives on the market. The 3 seaborne terminals that I mentioned are limited to taking only coasters and cannot accept very large gas carriers, which are primarily used for long-distance seaborne deliveries from producing countries like the US. Also, their storage space is relatively small, and the ability to move products to inland consumption centers is capped by rail access at the ports. There are projects that works to boost seaborne capacity. One can think of expansion of Orlen's Szczecin terminal, but this will not be completed until mid-2025. And the limitations I mentioned mean that the market needs to source more product from the ARA trading hub via rail. But there are a lot of problems with that as well. Most of the infrastructure in Poland is located near the eastern border, given the historical background, with limited number of inland terminals that could accept rail cars, let alone block trains. And the route depends on the famously unreliable German rail network, which has been undergoing substantial maintenance and modernization works, which will do great for logistics in the long run, but for now they're capping their availability. The shift also requires a lot of additional rail tanks, keeping logistics quite tight. But beside all the logistical issues, there's also simple issue of money. Russian propane-butane mix rail cars at the Poland-Belarus border average around $500 in 2024, which is almost 100 more than $130 per ton less than equivalent RR rail cars. And that meant that even with the announcement of the embargo in 2023, many Polish importers signed contracts with Russian exporters that run until the deadline. And Russia actually increased their share of Polish LPG imports in the first half of 2024 to around 53%. And non-petrochemical seaborne LPG imports into the country actually fell by almost 16% on the year, dipping below 1 million tons for the first time since 2021.
It's very interesting. So basically, if I summarize in kind of one or two sentences here, if you remove the 1.5 million tons of Russian imports into Eastern Europe, there is obviously a cost to doing so because of the logistics around this, and ultimately this was a logical flow which had been going on for some decades. So that's gonna, even if the market is prepared, there is going to be some period where it has to adjust and has to pay those additional prices and deal with those logistical concerns. And so then I guess the next question is, what did that kind of do to the market mood and the sentiment and the kind of thinking about the future in the lead up to the imposition of the sanctions on the 20th of December 2024?
Yes, the market was not optimistic in the lead up to embargo. And say the mood, I could describe it as somber. They had sort of a taste of what was to come in the lead up, as Russian deliveries dropped significantly since the summer. I think the share dropped to about 30% by October, from over 50% the first half of the year, because of the variety of factors: payment difficulties, custom issues at the border, and higher prices in Russia itself. And this drop in Eastern supply forced Polish importers to scramble for alternatives, which increased Polish spot demand, lifting propane railcar prices at the ARA hub to their highest premium to large cargo since early 2022. That occurred in November. And this increasing share of Western product translated into higher domestic autogas prices, which rose by about 15% since the summer. And the customers for autogas are very price sensitive. So there was a lot of discussions of possible shortages, logistical issues, higher prices, and demand destruction at the industry conference last October, which I attended.
So did this mean that shortage and logistical problems materialized?
Actually, funny enough, no. The opposite happened. There was an overzealous stock building drive on the part of importers, combined with a very poor domestic demand and lower re-exports to Ukraine, all tilted the Polish market long as the embargo started. A bit of context here: Russian-oriented importers rushed to get as much LPG as possible before 20th of December from Russia, which actually pushed DAF Brest prices to a 22-month high by the end of October. And this was partly to create a sort of a cushion against the immediate impact of the shift, but also it was driven by concerns that supplies could stop ahead of the ban, because Russian exporters were keen to avoid the rail cars being stuck on the wrong side of the border. But product actually continued to flow for much longer than anticipated, with the last deliveries from Russian plants leaving as late as early December. And this rush left Eastern Polish terminals with a backlog of rail cars waiting to clear the customs before the deadline. At the same time, Polish importers that were oriented more towards Northwest Europe has also increased their intake since the autumn, because they were expecting the supply deficit, I guess, to emerge almost immediately following the embargo. So you just had very large volumes coming from both West and East. And also most importers were quite optimistic about how much product will be needed to cover the market coming 2025, and signed substantial term contracts with Western suppliers. But all this hit the wall of very poor demand. The country's autumn demand boost from crop drying was much shorter and feebler following a dry summer. The heating season had a very slow start, with the average temperature in Poland in January being about over 3 degrees Celsius above long-term average. And sales of autogas, which is worth mentioning, accounts for about 75% of Polish LPG use, headed into market off-season, a bit accelerated by the price increases that I mentioned before.
And then Voldemar, one question here is related to the butane situation, because pure butane is not sanctioned. So what's happened with that?
Well, yes, that's the only product that is still allowed to cross the border from Russia, from the east, and it began to do so in large numbers. So just as the embargo was approaching, the country started taking more pure normal butane from Russia. And Russian normal and isobutane supplies reached about 15,000 tons in December, similar but smaller 13,000 tons in January, compared to 4 to 10,000 tons a month that you would see in pre-embargo times. This could actually increase to as much as 20 to 35,000 tons per month in 2025, according to Argus estimates, given Russian product availability. Polish importers then mix this pure butane into propane source from Northwest Europe and sell it domestically as autogas and LPG. So while it creates a bit of a logistical headache with getting products from two different sources and mixing it together, it did ease expected supply problems after the embargo.
Okay, yeah, all understood there on the butane. Interesting numbers you're telling us there in terms of that growth. And then just to look in the neighboring countries, in particular Ukraine, and we've seen since the initial start of the Ukraine-Russia conflict that Ukraine looked west into the European Union for its products, having prior to that bought Russia. And of course, now if we've got this different situation, particularly in Poland on the western border there, what has been the result of that in terms of the flows and the situation?
Well, actually, the situation with re-exports to Ukraine helped greatly the market avoid any problems with supply, because buying interest from Ukraine dropped significantly in the lead up to 20th December. So, as you mentioned, initially Ukraine's western border became the main entry point for LPG imports as the country readjusted to the loss of Russians shipments. And the Polish industry played a key role there, with the country's exports to Ukraine doubling year on year to almost 400,000 tons in 2023. But then in 2025, we saw a major shift in the landscape, as on the Polish side, the gradual decline in Russian deliveries that I mentioned turned the market tight, with players experiencing shortages and surging prices, which weighted heavily on their ability to export product. But at the same time, Ukrainian buyers turned to cargoes arriving in the south from Romania and Danube ports, which were more competitive in terms of pricing. And consequently, Polish re-exports to Ukraine dropped by over 40% in 2024. And there wasn't that much draw for product from Ukraine.
Understood. And then how did this impact prices?
So as I mentioned, the prices in Northwest Europe initially surged in the lead up to embargo, as Polish importers had to replace Russian product and build stocks. But after the embargo, given the very limited domestic demand and steady flow of product from all sides, it seems, between Russia from the east and propane via ports and rail, Polish companies suddenly found themselves with too much product. So they started minimizing our imports as much as they could, and even began reselling their contracted tons into Northwest Europe. And that resulted in rail cars premiums to large cargo in the ARA trading hub dropping by 1/3 in the month following 20 December, and they hit actually a 15-week low mid-January. As a
Okay.
result.
Yeah, interesting. And then, so as you mentioned, we're now into February. It's sort of getting towards the back end of winter, and then we move then into what's the wider European low season and so on. But then, of course, that's the autogas high season. What do you think's sort of in the works as we go into this change of the seasons?
Well, we spoke a bit about the stocks that Polish importers built in the lead up to embargo, but Poland actually has a very limited storage capacity. It's about 100,000 tons. Just compare it to almost 300,000 tons that Belgium has, which means that those December stocks have probably been consumed by now, even with the poor demand. So Poland more depends now on continuous flow of product. But hitting demand should be covered by early end user buying, provided that the weather does not surprise and it's not very outside seasonal norms. As I mentioned, that hasn't happened so far. And while the region is expecting a cold snap in the second half of February, it might prove not to be enough to move the needle. So we could actually see markets stay in this long-ish phase until spring when autogas demand picks up. Of course, there are a few caveats there. One is there's no logistical problems that we mentioned with the supply lines being very vulnerable to it. We recently had a problem, the Polish market recently had a problem with supplies from East, not Russia, but Kazakhstan, with customs blocking the entry of products for 3 weeks there, which has been now resolved, but this one of the hiccups that can appear. The storms of the Baltic Sea, maintenance or accidents, German rail. A lot of things could happen that may change the situation, but for now, the Polish market is leaning more long and may stay so for a month or two.
Brilliant. That's a great way to sum things up. Thanks, Valdemar. And we'll check in again, I'm sure, in a couple of months' time to see what the situation is in Eastern Europe. So thank you very much. And thank you to our listeners. And we look forward to doing another one of these podcasts in the near future. Keep an eye out on your various social media and other feeds for that.